Hello, I'm Dr. Brian Fraser, and in this video I'll be showing the expected look of the Compute 213 web UI as provided for Assignment 5. So on the screen now is basically what it's going to look like when it loads up and working. A couple things before we get to actually looking at the UI. The first thing is the sample code that's provided is in a zip file. When you look in that zip file, there'll be a public folder. You want to put that into your project inside the main sort of root of your project. So here you can see I've got my source folder down here with all my Java code. In the same sort of underneath my project, I've got this public folder. Anything inside of a public folder will automatically be served by the Tomcat server inside of Spring Boot. And so we can just put the files here, for example, about.html, index.html, and so forth, and they'll automatically visible from my web browser when I've got it running. So here I've got it running. I'm at the index page, which is going to be for browsing. I'm going to start actually showing you about the About page. It's the easiest one to get wired up. And so it's got here the couple fields. This is one, and here's another one that get passed in from the back end. A couple things I can do. I can do a model dump, which when I execute it will spit it out on my console inside of IntelliJ. Let me just swing that over here. This is the console that got all that text spewed out into it. So we don't really care much about that. It was useful for the first part of the assignment, but not really again. If I look on the right hand side, I'll hit F12. I'm inside Chrome. So normally a web page looks like this. I've brought up the developer's console, so hit F12 to bring that up. And it gives me a bunch of options for actually seeing what's going on. So here we can see that there were two calls. Let me just kind of open these up. That were made to the server, one of which was, second one was my dump message, but let's just look at the first one here. So the first one was the data that came back. First one, app name, Brian's awesome sample app. Feel free to change that to whatever you like. And then of course author name, that should be your name. This is just proving that we're getting data from the back end and it comes up on the front end. If that doesn't work, pretty much nothing else on this app is going to work. So get that working first. If anything goes wrong, you'll then see in here, I don't have any code to demonstrate that at the moment, but you'll see big red text describing what failed, which may help you debug the failure. Okay, so let's have a look at what the sort of primary function of this is. I'm going to stretch this over, give myself a bit more room. On the browse one, which is the index.html, I can on the left select a department. So let's start with computing science. And on the very left-hand side here, we can see that it lists all of the currently known computing science courses. So let's pick one. 213 doesn't have too many instances. And then in the middle, it gives us a listing of all of the offerings that have ever been had. And these are going to be in sorted order from the first one through to the last one. And so your server must end up handing me sorted data to the front end. So we can pick on one of these instances. So here's one instance. And we can see that it is one section. It's got a lecture, and the capacity with our 91 students enrolled and total capacity of 90. So it's over enrolled. We can look at some other courses. For example, I happen to know 213 or 130 often has tutorials. And look at the last time I taught that course. We can see here that there is a lab and a lecture. And it gives us that information. As I switch between things, so if I switch, for example, to IAT, we can maybe pick one of these courses. There aren't many offerings here because they restructured the departments. The data is only back to the restructuring. But we can kind of see any of these data that's available. Some of the data that we're going to see is not going to maybe make sense, but that's okay. It's just whatever data came out of the database. Okay, so the next thing I want to show is the graph, in fact. This is going to show us the sort of total seats in courses offered by a department per semester. So let's just pick computing again. And it shows us here, let me get rid of the console to buy us some extra space for the graph. Across the bottom are all the different semesters. This is from the very first semester in the dataset all the way through the last semester in the dataset, only showing data for the spring, summer, and fall semesters. So that ends in a 1, 4, and 7. And for each of these, we've gone through and we've calculated how many seats were available. Or not, pardon me, available, but taken. So for every lecture section that is in that semester, we sum them all up, and we found out here, for example, that there was almost 2,000 seats, and we can see a general pattern that the fall has, this one in the case, almost 4,000 seats, down to 3,000 seats for the fall, and then the summer is down to almost 2,000 seats. And I can switch between different departments here. We can see what, for example, IAT looked like. Its data set, the data that's available for this is only through 2008 through 2009. After that, it became a different faculty, and we don't have the data for that. And finally, we've got the watchers. So the watchers is a feature where you can, on the server, create a watcher that is going to basically look for changes in the sections. We have the ability to add new sections to our data, effectively adding new rows to the CSV file that we initially processed, but doing this dynamically, so at runtime through the REST API. So at the moment, we can see here that we don't have any watchers available, and so I can't select any, but I can create a watcher. So I'm going to create a watcher for Compute 213, just because I happen to have my script set up to do that. And so once I've selected the Compute 213, I create watcher, and here it is. So there are currently 0 events for that recorded. We haven't done any changes to the data yet. I've got a terminal ready, and so I'm going to go back over here to my curl commands that I've got loaded. The first thing I need to do is I need to configure it as to which server to talk to. And now I can run my curl command. Oh, and then I also need to configure which departments and so forth. You'll need to change the IDs when your system runs, because you'll probably be assigning different IDs than I am. But these are the IDs that my system assigns. The IDs are irrelevant because you added the script to do that. So let's add a new offering here. So this one here, actually no, I don't need any of the IDs, pardon me. This is just editing data as though it was coming from the CSV file, which has no notion of IDs. So we're going to Compute 213, add a new lecture, and this is going to be in Imagine next year. So 2019. So we'll just see what this does. It does a couple interesting things for our data. I'll add that here. It tells us that it's been added successfully, gives us the HTTP code of 201 for added. And now, nothing has changed here because we do not have push notification. So I'm going to hit F5, reload. And now we can see here that there's one event on my watcher. I'll click on it, and it gives me the information as to what I'm expecting, the event that happened. So it tells me that it added a lecture here. I'm going to run the same command again, and we'll see what happens. Actually, in fact, what I'll do is I'll add another watcher. Again to Compute 213. We see that it has 0 events. Let me refresh this, F5. It still has 0 events because we just created it. It has not been watching long enough to detect that earlier event. So I'm going to go back here. I'm going to rerun the exact same command, creating the exact same thing as before. So now we've got 2 of them. We can see here that it tells me that, well, you've now got 180 people taking this section. I'm going to F5 to refresh. My previous observer, I'm calling it a watcher here, has 2 events, and my second one has only got the 1 event. So let's go back and look at the 2 events we have. We can see here that they were created about a minute apart, and each one is telling me just how many were added in that one case. So we have added an additional 90 seats, of which 89 are filled. So it's sort of just looking at the additional things that are being added. Now, the one last thing I want to show based on this data is, let's go back and look at the graph. The graph is going to, for compute now, we've got all of the graph here going along. This is valid data to here. I just added in those 2 extra seats. We say we got 178 students' seats and taking courses. There's no data available for these 2 points. They're still put in the data set as 0. So even if the semester had no offerings, or nobody taking courses in those offerings, then we still put it in the data set to show to the user. Okay, that summarizes the basics of what this UI should look like, how it should respond, and what you should be seeing as it executes. A couple of things that maybe just help you debug. let's go back here to the About screen. You can see the different commands as they're being executed. So I'm going to click dump. We see a new one come up here. You may or may not see something in your model when that happens. You can kind of trace through, see what happened. It's going to give you some information that may be useful, just looking at all of the things that actually occurred. You should not need to edit the UI as long as you're implementing the REST API as described, although you are welcome to edit both the REST API and the UI to make them match. If you do that, you must have in your project a docs folder, as shown here, and you must put in the curl commands that we're expecting to execute. Specifically of interest, we want to execute some errors. So I've got up here a big section of errors. So when we mark it, we're going to copy and paste the errors here. And let me go back over here. We can see that this error, I'm trying to find a non-existent department, I think. Yeah. So I tried to execute the curl command to get on the server department 9999 and get the courses for that. It doesn't exist, so it comes back with a 404 error as required. Alright, thank you for watching, and good luck!